welcome to my channel. My name's Linda, and on this channel I'm going to be sharing tips and tutorials, or for those of you who are just looking for some patterns. Today I have a tutorial on how to sew this sheer top with a really pretty rosette and ruffles off the shoulder. And if you want to use this sewing pattern for this top, I have a digital PDF sewing pattern that is available, and I'll have that as the first link down below. Now, if this is your very first time using a digital or PDF sewing pattern, I do have a dedicated video on how to properly print and assemble these, and I'm going to have that link down as well. And with that, let's get into it.
Now, just to start off, we got all of our pattern pieces here. And just for reference, the original top that I made was in this black mesh fabric. But today we're gonna be making the same top in this really pretty pink fabric. It's also a stretch mesh, and we've got the matching thread as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind as you're laying out your fabric, you're gonna wanna find that grain line. So what you're gonna wanna do is check the stretch of your fabric in both directions, parallel or perpendicular to the edges of your fabric. So here's one side, and then if I were to stretch it the other side, you'll notice that this direction is a lot less stretchy than the other one. That's your grain line. And so you'll always just want to make sure that you're matching up the grain line of your fabric with the grain line marking on your pattern piece. And what you'll end up seeing is that your cross grain, which is the more stretchy side, is the direction that's going around your body, and that's what we want. And now just cutting out our front and back bodice pieces with the place on fold marking placed directly on the fold of the fabric. And that's just going to give us two perfectly symmetrical halves once you open that fabric up. Just to note that all of these pattern pieces, as noted, include all of its seam allowances. So as you're cutting out your pieces, there's no need to add additional seam allowance. Also a reminder, as you cut out your pattern pieces, you also want to make sure to transfer any notches. So those are identified with those little triangles along the cut lines. That will be important to have as reference later on. Next up is pattern piece C. This is our spiral that we're going to use to create our rosette and then our two ruffle pieces. As marked on the pattern, the rosette, you're going to want to follow point 1 all the way down to point 3, and you're going to want to cut one of those. And then for the two ruffles, you're going to cut from point 1 only up to point 2, and we're going to need 2 of those. Now for these spiral pieces, what I'd recommend is actually placing the fabric on top of your pattern piece. Since we're working with sheer fabric, this way we'll be able to see the pattern piece through the fabric and be able to follow along all the spiral lines within the circle. And now just weighing down the fabric just so it doesn't shift around as I'm cutting, and we're going to go ahead and cut out our one full spiral for our rosette. And here's the first one, and you'll see as you pick up the spiral, you end up just with this really pretty ruffled effect. And now you can just repeat that same process, but only cutting out 2 partial spirals for our ruffle pieces. And the final pattern piece is just this rosette base, so you'll just need to cut out one of these. What we're gonna start off with is finishing off the edges of all of our spiral pieces. Now with each of our spiral pieces, we're gonna lay them down flat to find the middle point of where the spiral started. So it should look something like this. And this is the end of the spiral that we're going to start with. You're going to do 2 separate stitches from one end all the way around your outer side of the spiral, and then same thing within the inner side of the spiral. All right, now moving over to our sewing machine, I'm going to replace the standard presser foot with an overlock or an overcast foot. And this is essentially going to make it a lot easier for us to guide the edge of our fabric to finish these spiral pieces with a zigzag stitch. Now, if you don't have an overlock foot, you can definitely still do this with a regular presser foot, just noting that it might just take a little bit more finessing and you might need to go a little bit more slowly just to make sure that you're catching the fabric right along the edge. Now, in terms of stitch settings, I'll show you what I have mine set at that you can use as a starting point, but I always recommend that before you start sewing, definitely test it out on your own machine and with your specific fabric, just to make sure that the finish comes out exactly as expected. So I've got my tension at about just under a 4 here. And in terms of the stitch, I'm using a standard zigzag stitch at 1.2 length and 3.5 width. One thing to also note when you're using an overlock foot, before you start sewing with your specific settings, use your hand wheel just to make sure that your needle isn't hitting any of the metal parts of the overlock foot before you proceed. All right, now bringing over our first spiral, again, making sure that we're starting with the center of the spiral. One thing I would note is to try avoid starting at the very tip of the spiral. Give yourself about half an inch or even an inch of space, and you'll see later on that this section won't be visible either way. This just makes sure that your fabric won't get pulled in and get stuck in the machine. And from here, we'll just start off with a couple stitches, and don't forget to back stitch, and then just continue to guide the stitches right along the edge of the fabric all the way to the other end. If ever you feel like your fabric is getting stuck or not feeding through properly, it's helpful to have your second hand just lightly guiding the fabric to make sure that it's feeding through nice and smoothly. Now, once you reach one end of your spiral, we're just going to avoid backstitching at this point because there's a high likelihood that the fabric is just going to simply get stuck in your machine. So instead, we're just going to finish feeding it through and cutting off the thread. And then you might end up with some of these small little loops if you went a little bit past the tip of your fabric, but that's okay. You can just undo them and then tie a couple knots on the end just to secure it in place. And now just go ahead and repeat that on all edges of your spiral pieces as well as your rosette base piece. Generally speaking as well, you never want to be tugging on your fabric as you're feeding it through. However, in this case, I actually quite like the very slight bit of lettuce hem effect on the edge of these ruffles. But again, I'm not pulling very hard. It's really just using my back hand to lightly guide the fabric through, which gives it a little bit of that slight pull. All right, now putting those pieces to the side for a second, we're gonna move now on to our front bodice and our back bodice pieces. So we're gonna open these up. This is our back piece and our front piece, and I'm just gonna flip the front piece over so that we have our pieces right sides together. Now we're gonna start off with the side seams, and now what we're gonna do is starting by making sure our notches are aligned and pinning that down, and then we'll go ahead and pin down the rest of the side seams. And now we're just gonna sew along both of these seams with a 3/8 seam allowance. Back to our sewing machine. Now for our seams, I'm gonna be using a lightning bolt stitch. However, if you don't have this stitch option, a standard zigzag stitch is perfectly fine, and I would start with a stitch length of 1.4 and a width of 1.0. But again, please play around with these settings to make sure that these settings work well for your specific fabric. We're also going to switch over from our overlock foot back to our regular presser foot, and then just sewing along both of our side seams with a 3/8 seam allowance, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of each stitch. And this is just a general reminder to always press your seams as you go. Now here we have our side seams done, and now we're gonna deal with our shoulder seams. Now one thing to note in general, but you'll notice it especially in these shoulder seams, as you'll see, it almost looks like these shoulder seams are not in alignment when you look at the raw edges. However, if you measure out 3/8 from that edge, you'll see that the stitch line actually matches up perfectly, which is exactly what we're looking for. You always wanna make sure that we're not aligning our raw edges of the fabric, but rather the stitch line. Now this is just a prime example of why marking our notches and making sure that they're perfectly aligned is super important, because that'll essentially make sure that all our stitch lines are nicely aligned. Now we're gonna grab the two shorter spiral pieces, which will be our two ruffles, and similarly to before, we're gonna try to find where the center of where that spiral started. And those are our two ends that we're gonna attach into our shoulder seams. There's one of them there, and on the other one, gonna be on this end right here. Now what we're gonna do is take those two ends and stack them on top of each other so that they're aligned. Now remembering that our fabric right now is right sides together, in order to make sure that the ruffles will be coming out on the right side, we're gonna feed these two pieces through the bottom, sandwiched in between the front and back bodices. And this way, all of our right sides are encased within the top. Now, I'm choosing to attach my ruffles and rosette on the right shoulder, but you're welcome to do so on the left shoulder as well. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna first find the notch. And so we're gonna wanna place our ruffles on the side of the notch that's closer towards the shoulder. So in this case, it's gonna be on the right-hand side. Now, if you're doing your ruffles on your left shoulder, you're gonna wanna place the ruffles on the left side of that notch. Now, also just taking note, the two different sides of the ruffle. So we'll want to place the outer side of the ruffle, so the edge that's more rounded, towards the edge of the shoulder, like so. We then just want to grab our ruler, and we're going to measure the point at which the spiral reaches about 1.5 inches. And that's going to be the part of the spiral that we're going to line up with the raw edge in the shoulder seam. And now once you've got that lined up, right up against that notch, we're just going to pin it down to hold it in place, while making sure the two ruffles are at equal width at the point of the stitch line. And then you're gonna grab the other shoulder seam that's gonna fit on top, match up our notches, and I'm just gonna first take out one of the pins that we previously put in and place back the top layer and pin back through all of the layers to secure it all in place. And then you're just gonna continue pinning down the rest of this shoulder as well as the other shoulder. Again, just always making sure that your stitch lines are nicely lined up by matching up our notches. And now coming back to our sewing machine, we're just gonna sew down those seams similarly to our side seams with that 3/8 seam allowance. Only thing to make sure here is with the ruffles, just making sure that they're nicely sandwiched in. And here now you can see our finished shoulder seams. Now with the right side with the ruffles, obviously we have these pieces sticking out. All we're gonna do is take our fabric scissors and cut that right up to that raw edge of the seam allowance. And now we're just gonna finish the edges of the side seams and the shoulder seams that we just sewed down with an overlock stitch, or if you don't have an overlock stitch, you're just gonna use a standard zigzag stitch as such, and then just repeating that on the other side seam as well as the two shoulder seams. And now just flipping everything right sides out, you can now start to see the top taking form with the ruffles coming out of the shoulder. And now what we have left is just our neckline, our two armholes, and the bottom hem, which we're now gonna finish similarly to how we finished our spiral pieces. And coming back to the sewing machine, again, we're using the exact same finish that we used on our rosette and ruffle pieces, reattaching our overlock foot if you have one, and you're just gonna use that zigzag stitch all along the edge of the neckline, the armholes, and the bottom hem. Now we have our finished top, and all we have left to do is the fun part of sewing our rosette and attaching that onto the shoulder. All right, now to start off our rosette, we're gonna be finding the outer edge of the circle this time. So as you can see, the bottom end here kind of wraps around the larger part of the circle, and that's the end that we're gonna start at. So what we're gonna do here is we're actually gonna use a hand needle. I've played around with a couple different methods in making these rosettes, and the method of hand basting these stitches was the method that I found worked the best and was just the easiest to kind of manipulate and get the proper shape that you want. So now what we're going to do along the entire length of this spiral piece is hand baste a stitch so that we can gather it all up. And here just start off by threading your needle and tying off the end. I always use this one method to tie off the end of my thread. You can feel free to do that or use your own method. So you'll essentially place the end of your thread on top of your needle, give it a couple wraparounds, and then lightly pull it down over your needle and all the way to the bottom of your thread. And you'll end up with this nice little knot at the end of your thread. So now what we're gonna do along the entire length of this spiral piece, we're gonna run a basting stitch all along the straight edge of the spiral, or you can think about it as the inner edge of the spiral. And with the basting stitch, just leaving a good amount of space in between each stitch. And we're just gonna keep going over and under. And that's what's ultimately gonna allow us to gather up our rows. And I'll just do another couple stitches here just so you can see what this looks like, and then just gonna fast forward as I continue this process. Okay, and once you get to a point where you've gotten a good amount of the way through, maybe a third of the way or so, take a pause and start gathering up that rosette. And so we're just gonna take this and slowly gather that through, and you'll start to see the base of your rosette starting to form up. With the base, you can also kind of assess how big you want your actual rosette to be. If you decide that you want a much smaller rosette, you can just make your gathers a lot tighter by pulling on your thread like this. And as you can see, you end up with a much smaller base. Now, I quite like the size of the original rosette that I made for my black top, so I'm just going to use that as a quick reference. And for you guys to use as a guide, this is landing at about the 4.5 to 5 inch mark as your base. So from there, you can decide if you want to make your base a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. Now, as you do this, it's going to be a lot easier to manage all of these gathers and ruffles if you handle it section by section. So almost think of the entire rosette as broken up into thirds. And so as we move through the rosette, we're going to do one section at a time and tie off the end at the end of each section. Okay, and now doing the exact same thing and continuing to baste along that same edge of the ruffle. One thing to note, you'll see that I'm slowly starting to ease and move my basting stitch a little bit further away from that inner edge of the spiral. And I'm doing this intentionally because as we move towards the center of our rosette, we're gonna want those flounces to be a little bit smaller as we gather towards the center of the rosette. And otherwise, just continuing the exact same way through, and we're gonna do another check-in at about another third of the way up. Okay, and now taking a look at where our gathers are at this point, and now you can really start to see the shape of the rosette forming up. And we're just gonna kind of fiddle around with it until we're happy with the amount of volume and locking that into place. And then following the exact same process through to the very center of the spiral. Okay, and now that we've got our entire rosette gathered up, we're just gonna play around with it a little bit and get the shape that we want. You'll also wanna make sure there's kind of that side of the spiral that's closer to the straight edge that's sticking out. We're gonna wanna kind of shove that underneath, and that's gonna really help our rosette puff up right in the center. Okay, and this part of forming out the rosette is just gonna take a little bit of manual manipulation to play around with the shape, pushing different sections over, and creating the shape that you like. And now I'm starting to really like how this is shaping up. So obviously right now, none of this shape is actually sewn down. So what we're gonna do is take our rosette base and attach that to the bottom of our rosette. Really carefully grab all of this, and we're just gonna place our rosette base right on top like that. So this way we have something to sew down to. And now just starting to sew down our rosette onto the base. And I'm just gonna go right in, all the way through, and then bring it back up through the rosette. And now I'm just gonna tie that down. Obviously you can do multiple stitches at once, but I do find that, especially for the first couple stitches, it does help to just do the one at a time because it just gives you a lot more control as to where you're sewing down each piece. And because you are very much manually manipulating a lot of this rows, the more control you have, the more you can really play around and get the exact shape that you like. Okay, and now I'm just gonna continue this process of adding in stitches and tying them down until the majority of the rosette is at least secured down to the base. Okay, so for example, right here, I'm not loving how the top has kind of lost its shape. I really like when the top of the rosette is nice and voluminous and puffed up. And so what you're gonna do is, for example, here you can see that we've got the straight edge of that original spiral, and you're just gonna kind of push that almost underneath itself, and that's gonna help really puff the top of that rosette right back up. And again, just following the same process of adding our stitches and tying them up. Okay, and now I'm super happy with the final shape here. And one thing that I want to quickly show you guys here as well is that this is the rosette that I made in the black fabric. The black rosette comes out a little bit more structured looking, whereas the pink one has a little bit more of that kind of loose flounce to it. I personally think both look great, but if you do have a preference in terms of how you want your rosette to turn out, that's just something to consider when you're picking out your fabric. A fabric that's a little bit thicker, has a little bit more of that sturdiness, is going to come out ultimately looking more structured than one that has a little bit more of a softer feel. And now finally bringing back our top here, we're going to add our rosette onto the shoulder on top of our ruffle pieces. So just make sure that your two ruffles are going in opposite directions. So one ruffle towards the back and one towards the front. And our rosette is just going to go right on top. And now just flipping it over so we're looking at the inside of that shoulder seam. In terms of placement, we're going to aim to have the shoulder seam lined up with the middle of the rosette and aim to place the center of your two ruffles around the middle point of the base of your rosette. And then just going to pin this into place and take a look at how I'm liking it. You can do a try on at this point if you want, just to make sure that it is sitting at the right place where you're expecting it to be. And then we're just gonna grab our hand needle again, and we're just gonna stitch alongside the seam here. And we're just gonna aim to catch the bottom couple layers of the rosette without disturbing the actual shape of the rosette itself. We just wanna catch it enough so that it stays in place. One final check to do is just take a look at your stitches along the bottom of your rosette just to make sure that it caught enough of it that it won't be going anywhere. And if you need to, you can always just add a second line of stitching. And there we have it.
That's the tutorial. If this was helpful or if you enjoyed this pattern, please give this video a thumbs up. And if you want to see more patterns like this, feel free to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for more. You can also follow me on my TikTok at LindaQZhang. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time.